Hello, and in this episode, I want to look at one of the great biblical texts that Christians are really highlight to prove that Jesus is God, that Jesus became incarnate as a human being, even as a slave to the point of death, and God exalted him to the highest level, that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So this shows that Jesus is God and that God became a man, and this is the great proof that Christians share. And this is from the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 onwards, 6 to 11. And I'll put the verse in full, the passage in full, under the video so you can follow along. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which is the one preferred by academics rather than the more evangelical translations like the NIV or the ESV and so on. And I just want to suggest that this understanding of the passage is wrong-headed and is more a case of eisegesis rather than exegesis. Eisegesis meaning when you read something into a text, in this case, later Christian theology. Exegesis is where you pay close attention to what the text actually says in its historical context and try to understand what the author's meaning is rather than reading into it later ideas. So I'm just going to read the passage, and then I'm going to share with you some comments by one of the world's great biblical scholars, Jimmy Dunn, from his Christology in the Making, which I think gives a very different reading of the passage and is truer to the mind and thinking of Paul as far as we can uncover that from the first century context. So and this is to do really, what does the Bible say about Jesus? Does the Bible really say Jesus is God, it is Yahweh, or does it say something different and slightly more interesting and complicated? So coming to Philippians chapter 2, it says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality of God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." End quote. So that is talking about the incarnation of Jesus Christ as God into a form of a human being, into a slave, where God then died and was exalted to the highest level of Godhead himself. So that's the claim. I'm not convinced that says that. There are several reasons why I think that reading is inaccurate and unfaithful to the plain meaning of the text, for one. Before I come to my own further thoughts, I'll just share with you some words from Christology in the Making by Jimmy Dunn. I've mentioned this book before. This is an advanced text. I highly recommend it. Some very detailed discussion about who Jesus was, as understood by his earliest followers and by the second and third generation of Christians. And he says the following on page 114. "It seems to me that Philippians 2, 6 to 11 is best understood as an expression of Adam Christology, one of the fullest expressions that we still possess." And then I'll fast forward it, and he concentrates initially on verses 6 and 7. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality of God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And Dunn says it quickly becomes evident that its development is determined by a double contrast. First, between form of God and form of slave, and second, between equality with God and in the likeness of men. The best way to understand this double contrast is as an allusion to Genesis 1 to 3, an allusion once again to the creation and fall of man. In the first contrast, morphe theo, he's quoting in Greek, morphe theo means the form of God, probably refers to Adam having been made in the image, and then icon, he writes that in Greek, of God, and with a share of the glory, doxa, of God. Doxa is the Greek word for God. For it has long been recognized that morphe, in Greek, form, and icon, image, are near synonymous. I wish I didn't know that actually, even though I read the passage before. That was a good reminder. And that in Hebrew thought, the visible form of God is his glory. Morphe doulou, Greek meaning form of a slave, probably refers therefore to what Adam became as a result of his fall. He lost his share in God's glory and became a slave. That is, either to corruption, the parallel with Romans 8:18 is close, or to the elemental spirits, compare Galatians 4:3. In the second contrast, equality with God probably alludes to Adam's temptation. Genesis chapter 3 verse 5. You will be like God, the gods. And therefore, likeness of men, probably by way of contrast, denotes the kind of man that Adam became, and so the kind of man that all men now are. And he says, here again we observe a close parallel in the earlier Pauline expressions of Adam Christology in Romans chapter 1 verse 23, etc. Now, I won't go into all of that. It's quite detailed and dense exegesis. But I actually think he's got a point, actually, that we're dealing here with an implied contrast with Genesis 1 to 3, with Adam, his status before God as image of God, and then the fall when he lost that. Jesus as the second Adam, as the new Adam, restoring that status. In fact, though even greater, he was exalted to a divine status. So moving on, the passage continues in verses 9, 10, 11. After Jesus has become obedient to the point of death, even on the cross. It then says, verse 9, therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. Now, notice what's happening here. God and Jesus are two separate entities, two separate beings. God is the Father. In Judaism, in the New Testament, God is the Father. Nearly in every instance, with a few exceptions where God is mentioned, it refers to God as Father. The few exceptions are where the word God is used of Jesus. It's used, I would argue, in the sense that other figures in the Bible also have that word applied to them, human beings, merely human beings, like in Psalm 46, verses 6 and 7, where the king is addressed as God. And also in John 10, interestingly, where Jesus himself quotes Psalm 82 to refute the idea that he is claiming deity. Ye are as gods, as it says in Psalm 82. Anyway, I'm going to get involved in that. So God gives Jesus, therefore God also highly exalted him. So God did something to someone else, Jesus, and gave him the name that is above every name. So Jesus didn't have this status or this name before God, someone else, gave it to Jesus. So Jesus is not God here. He is the recipient of an action by God himself. And at the very end, it says, every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. So notice the doxa in Greek, doxa in English. The glory of God the Father. It's the God who gets the glory, and he is the Father. It's not Jesus who is God. But Jesus is certainly exalted to the highest possible level, to the right hand of God. I'm not denying that he becomes a divine figure in that sense. But ontologically, in terms of his being, he is raised to that status by the divinity, by the omnipotent Father, by Yahweh. Yahweh does this to Jesus and honors him with this incredibly exalted status. So it's possible then for later readers of this passage who perhaps are not carefully attending to what Paul is saying to think, well, you have God the Father and Jesus is the Son, so you have the Father and the Son, and they're both obviously God, and you have binitarianism, and then you have Trinitarianism ultimately. But that's not what Paul is saying. There's no Trinity here. There is, I grant you it's really breaking the bounds of monotheism to have alongside God another being who's also has that highest name. I'm not saying this is great theology, But I don't think it's Trinitarianism or even binitarianism in the strict sense. I think we still have monotheism, where God does things to Jesus, exalting him, giving him a name. But ultimately, and that very last bit, to the glory of God the Father, really rounds off the passage and gives it its theological context. All that happens to Jesus is to the glory of God the Father, and God the Father is the name of God and how God is understood throughout the New Testament. So that is interesting. Now, to confirm this reading, because this is interpretation, we can look at a clearer passage from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you want to understand in Paul's thinking about the hierarchy in heaven, who is the ultimate authority, who is subordinate, who is Jesus, who is God. If you want to really understand that, we still have another passage which clarifies this for us. Now, Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians about Jesus and God post-resurrection. Paul was writing in the 50s AD, perhaps 20 years after Jesus' ascension into heaven. So this is not about Jesus' earthly life, this passage. He's talking about theology, what Paul believes is the case now, definitively. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3 onwards, he's talking about head covering. So this is not even the subject of the passage, but he does mention it in passing. He says, I want you to understand, Corinthians, that Christ is the head of every man. So that's amazing. Christ is the head of every man. Wow. And the husband is the head of the wife. So patriarchy is endorsed. And God is the head of Christ. And man who prays and prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. So he's talking about head coverings. But in passing, he says God is the head of Christ. Now, this is not Trinitarianism. If the Bible taught Trinitarianism, would say the Father and the Son are both equally the head of man, or that they are equally to be worshipped, or they're both co-eternal with in being, or whatever formulaic you want to come up with. But it says here a very clear hierarchy. So the lowest rung you have the wife, and the head of the wife is the man, the husband, and the head of the man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. God, Christ, man, woman. That is the theology and the theological anthropology of the universe, of existence. It's, as I say, it's not Trinitarian. It clearly posits that God is a separate being from Christ. Christ has a God. And if Christ has a God, in the monotheist worldview, he cannot be God, because there's only one God. So I think that reading of Philippians is endorsed by this passage in 1 Corinthians, that Paul is not saying that Jesus is God the Father, and God the Father is God in the New Testament. He certainly has he's not merely a human either, but he's not Yahweh, he's not the biblical God. Although he's not just a regular guy either. So I think that this proves that a later Trinitarian theology is just that, a later development. It's not what the Bible teaches. And Paul, indeed, his thrust of his thought goes against that, because the Christ, the Son, has a God, and therefore cannot be God, logically. So those are just some of my views. Till next time.